What if I told you that somewhere in Denver, locked away in a psychiatrist's archives, are thousands of photographs that shouldn't exist, images captured not by light, but by the human mind itself? Picture this, a dimly lit hotel room in Chicago, 1964. A bellhop named Ted Serios sits hunched over a Polaroid camera, pressing a small paper tube to his forehead. He calls it his gizmo. The camera clicks. The photo develops, and there on the film is an image of a building he's never seen in a city he's never visited. No lens cap removed, no double exposure, no trick of light, just thought, somehow burned into silver halide crystals. This is the strange, impossible story of thoughtography, the claimed ability to photograph invisibility itself, to capture the unseen landscapes of the human mind. And at its center is Ted Serios, a man whose very existence challenged everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality and the limits of human consciousness. Theodore Judd Serios wasn't born to greatness. He was born in Kansas City in 1918. He grew up during the Great Depression, drifting from job to job, city to city. By the 1960s, he'd settled into work as a bellhop at Chicago's Conrad Hilton Hotel, a perfectly ordinary man living a perfectly ordinary life. Except for one extraordinary claim, Ted Serios believed he could imprint his thoughts directly onto photographic film. The story of how the world came to know about Ted Serios begins, as many strange tales do, with a chance encounter. In 1963, a writer named Curtis Fuller heard whispers about this hotel worker who could somehow project images from his mind onto Polaroid film. Fuller, being a curious sort, decided to investigate. What he witnessed that day would launch one of the most controversial investigations in the history of parapsychology. Fuller watched as Serios performed what he called thoughtography, sitting before a Polaroid camera, often pressing that peculiar paper tube he called his gizmo against his forehead, concentrating intensely, and somehow producing photographs of places, buildings, and objects that existed nowhere in that Chicago hotel room. The images weren't always clear. Many were blurry, distorted, or fragmentary, but they were there, undeniably present on film that should have shown nothing but darkness. Intrigued but skeptical, Fuller reached out to Dr. Jewel Eisenbud, a psychiatrist and professor at the University of Colorado Medical School. Eisenbud was known for his interest in parapsychology, but he was also a rigorous scientist. His initial response to Fuller's claims was, quite reasonably, severe doubt and suspicion of fraud. After all, the idea that human consciousness could directly affect photographic emulsion seemed to violate everything science understood about the physical world. But Fuller persisted, and eventually Eisenbud agreed to meet Serios in person. That meeting would change both their lives forever. Between 1964 and 1967, Dr. Eisenbud conducted hundreds of controlled experiments with Ted Serios. These weren't casual demonstrations in hotel rooms. They were rigorous scientific investigations, often conducted with multiple witnesses, under conditions designed to eliminate any possibility of conventional trickery. Eisenbud documented everything meticulously, amassing thousands of photographs and detailed records of each session. The results, published in Eisenbud's 1967 book The World of Ted Serios, were nothing short of extraordinary. Serios appeared to produce images of identifiable buildings, landmarks, and objects, many of which he claimed never to have seen before. There were photographs of the Westminster Abbey, the Eiffel Tower, Chicago's Marina City Towers, and countless other recognizable locations. But perhaps even more intriguing were the impossible photographs, images that seemed to show familiar places with crucial details altered or that captured buildings from angles that shouldn't have been possible. One of the most remarkable examples was Serios's photograph of the Central City Opera House in Colorado. The image matched the actual building in almost every detail, except for two crucial differences. Where the real building showed a discolored patch of brick, Serios's photograph displayed a clear playbill. And while the real opera house had normal windows, his image showed them bricked up, a detail that according to Eisenbud's investigations had never actually occurred in the building's history. If you love uncovering these hidden tales of human mystery and the boundaries of what we thought possible, you'll feel right at home here. Stick around for more. But how did Serios actually do it? The process was as mysterious as it was controversial. Typically, he would sit facing a Polaroid camera, often in a darkened room. Sometimes he used his infamous gizmo, a simple tube made from rolled paper or cardboard, about an inch long, which he would press against his forehead or hold near the camera lens. He claimed this device helped him focus his psychic energy, though skeptics argued it could easily conceal some form of optical trickery. During a session, Serios would concentrate intensely, often appearing to strain with effort. Sometimes he would mutter or grunt, his face contorting with concentration. The camera would click, the film would develop, and, in successful attempts, an image would emerge. Not always, mind you. Many attempts produced only darkness or abstract smears of light. But when the photography worked, the results were undeniably striking. The scientific community's reaction to Eisenbud's research was, predictably, mixed. While some researchers found the evidence compelling, others remained deeply skeptical. The main criticisms centered around the possibility of fraud. Perhaps Serios was somehow smuggling pre-made transparencies or optical devices into his sessions. Or maybe he was using some form of sophisticated sleight of hand that even trained observers couldn't detect. Professional magicians were particularly vocal in their criticism. They argued that Serios's use of the gizmo provided the perfect opportunity for trickery. A small optical device could easily be concealed within the paper tube, allowing him to project pre-existing images onto the film. Some even demonstrated similar effects using conventional magic techniques. But Eisenbud and his colleagues insisted they had taken extensive precautions against fraud. The sessions were conducted under controlled conditions with multiple witnesses present. The cameras and film were often supplied by the researchers themselves, and Serios was frequently searched before sessions. In some experiments, he produced photographs even when the gizmo was taken away from him entirely. Moreover, there were aspects of Serios's phenomenon that seemed to defy simple explanations. The images he produced weren't just random photographs, they often showed remarkable consistency and detail. Some depicted buildings or locations that Serios claimed never to have visited, yet when researchers checked, they found these places existed exactly as shown in the photographs. Perhaps most puzzling were the blackies and whiteys, completely black or completely white photographs that Serios produced when his concentration faltered or when he claimed to be psychically blocked. These images seemed to serve no purpose if the entire phenomenon was fraudulent, yet they occurred consistently throughout the experiments. The case of Ted Serios also raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness and reality itself. If photography was real, it suggested that human consciousness could directly interact with physical matter in ways that conventional science couldn't explain. It challenged the fundamental assumption that mind and matter were separate, distinct entities. From a historical perspective, Serios wasn't the first person to claim the ability to produce psychic photographs. The phenomenon of photography had been reported in Japan since the late 19th century, where it was known as nensha. Japanese researcher Tomokichi Fukurai conducted extensive studies of several supposed photographers in the early 1900s, though his work was largely dismissed by Western science. But Serios's case was different in its scope and documentation. Never before had anyone claimed to produce photographs so consistently, and never had the phenomenon been studied so rigorously by a credentialed scientist. Eisenbud's meticulous documentation meant that, for the first time, the scientific community had to grapple seriously with the possibility that photography might be real. The broader implications were staggering. If consciousness could directly affect photographic film, what other aspects of the physical world might be susceptible to mental influence? The phenomenon suggested a universe far stranger and more interconnected than most scientists were prepared to accept. What twist surprised you most so far? The idea that a hotel bellhop might hold the key to understanding consciousness itself, or that his simple paper tube might be the most controversial scientific instrument of the 20th century. Let me know below. I might explore your favorite aspect next. Yet even as Eisenbud's research gained attention, the skepticism never fully disappeared. Critics pointed out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they argued that the evidence for Serios's abilities, while impressive, wasn't quite extraordinary enough. There were always alternative explanations, always the possibility that some form of sophisticated fraud was at work. The controversy deepened when other researchers attempted to replicate Eisenbud's findings. Some claimed success, reporting their own experiments with thoughtography, but others found nothing. No evidence of psychic photography, no mysterious images appearing on unexposed film. The phenomenon seemed frustratingly elusive, appearing for some investigators while remaining stubbornly absent for others. This inconsistency became one of the most problematic aspects of the Serios case. In legitimate science, phenomena should be reproducible. If thoughtography was real, other researchers should be able to observe it under similar conditions. The fact that some could, while others couldn't, raise serious questions about the validity of the entire enterprise. There were also troubling inconsistencies in Serios's own performances. His abilities seemed to come and go unpredictably. Sometimes he could produce dozens of clear thoughtgraphs in a single session. Other times he would strain for hours without producing anything recognizable. Believers argued this was simply how psychic phenomena worked. They were inherently unreliable and sensitive to psychological and environmental conditions. Skeptics saw it as evidence that the whole thing was an elaborate con game. Adding to the complexity was Serios himself. By all accounts, he was a complex, troubled individual. He struggled with alcoholism throughout his life, and his behavior during experiments was often erratic. Sometimes he would become belligerent or uncooperative. Other times, he seemed genuinely frustrated by his inability to produce results on demand. Those who worked closely with Serios described him as both fascinating and exasperating. He wasn't the stereotype of a smooth-talking charlatan. If anything, he seemed as puzzled by his supposed abilities as anyone else. He couldn't explain how he did what he claimed to do, and he often seemed frustrated by his inability to control the phenomenon. This psychological complexity made Serios a difficult subject for scientific study. Unlike the idealized conditions of a physics laboratory, experiments with Serios had to account for the messy realities of human psychology. His mood, his health, his relationships with the researchers, all of these factors seemed to influence his performance in ways that made traditional scientific analysis challenging. The story takes an even stranger turn when we consider the specific images Serios produced. These weren't just random pictures. Many showed remarkable specificity and accuracy. He produced recognizable photographs of the Chicago Water Tower, the Denver Hilton Hotel, various aircraft, and numerous other identifiable subjects. Some images showed buildings from unusual angles or perspectives, suggesting either extensive advanced knowledge or genuine psychic perception. But perhaps the most intriguing were the impossible images. Photographs that showed familiar places with inexplicable alterations. The Central City Opera House, with its mysteriously bricked-up windows, was just one example. There were other photographs that seemed to show buildings as they might have appeared at different times in their history, or from perspectives that wouldn't have been physically possible for a photographer to achieve. These impossible images were particularly difficult for skeptics to explain. If Serios was simply using concealed photographs or optical devices, why would he create images that didn't match reality? The alterations seemed to serve no purpose if the goal was simply to fool observers. Yet they appeared consistently throughout his sessions, adding another layer of mystery to an already puzzling phenomenon. The timeline of Serios's abilities also raises interesting questions. His most productive period was the mid-1960s, during his collaboration with Dr. Eisenbud. Before that, his abilities seemed sporadic and unreliable. After the intensive experimental period ended, his apparent psychic powers gradually faded. By the 1970s, he was rarely able to produce clear thoughtographies, and by the 1980s, the phenomenon seemed to have disappeared entirely. This rise and decline pattern is common in parapsychological cases, but it creates obvious problems for scientific validation. How can researchers study a phenomenon that appears and disappears seemingly at random? The transient nature of Sirius's abilities meant that later investigators often found themselves studying a man who could no longer demonstrate the very phenomena that had made him famous. Meanwhile, the scientific establishment remained largely unconvinced. The majority of researchers continued to view thoughtography as either fraud or delusion, despite Eisenbud's extensive documentation. The phenomenon was simply too far outside the accepted paradigms of physics and neuroscience to be easily accepted, no matter how carefully it had been studied. This resistance wasn't entirely unreasonable. Science progresses by building on established knowledge, and thoughtography required such a radical revision of our understanding of consciousness and physical reality that most scientists were understandably reluctant to embrace it without absolutely overwhelming evidence. The evidence, while impressive to some, never quite reached that overwhelming threshold for most of the scientific community. The broader cultural context of the 1960s also influenced how Sirius's claims were received. This was the era of the counterculture movement, of widespread interest in alternative spirituality and consciousness exploration. In some circles, thoughtography fit perfectly with the zeitgeist. It suggested that human consciousness was far more powerful and mysterious than mainstream science acknowledged. But this cultural association also worked against serious scientific consideration of the phenomenon. Many researchers worried that investigating psychic claims would damage their professional credibility, associating them with what some viewed as New Age pseudoscience. The very popularity of paranormal topics in popular culture made serious scientists more reluctant to engage with them professionally. This created a frustrating catch-22. The phenomenon was too extraordinary to be accepted without rigorous scientific study, but the scientific establishment was too skeptical to conduct such studies in the first place. Eisenbud found himself largely isolated, one of the few credentialed scientists willing to risk his reputation on such controversial research. The question of evidence loomed large throughout the entire Sirius saga. What would constitute sufficient proof of thoughtography? Even if researchers could eliminate every conceivable form of conventional fraud, would that be enough to establish the reality of psychic photography? Or would the scientific community simply assume that more sophisticated trickery was at work? This touches on a fundamental philosophical problem in the study of paranormal phenomena. Normal scientific claims can be accepted based on evidence that makes them more likely than existing alternatives. But paranormal claims often require not just positive evidence but the elimination of every conceivable normal explanation, a much higher bar that may be impossible to reach in practice. For thoughtography to be accepted, researchers would need to demonstrate not just that Sirius could produce mysterious photographs, but that these photographs were definitely produced by psychic means rather than by any form of conventional trickery, no matter how sophisticated. This proved to be an insurmountable challenge, even for investigators who were convinced by what they witnessed. The story of Ted Sirius also highlights the complex relationship between science and the media. Eisenbud's research generated significant popular interest, with articles appearing in magazines and newspapers around the world. But this media attention often focused more on the sensational aspects of the claims rather than the careful methodology of the research. This created additional problems for scientific evaluation. Media coverage often exaggerated or distorted the findings, making it harder for other scientists to understand what had actually been claimed and tested. Some researchers found themselves responding to sensationalized media accounts rather than to Eisenbud's actual research, further muddying the waters of scientific discourse. The case also raised important questions about the psychology of both believers and skeptics. Why were some researchers convinced by evidence that others found entirely unconvincing? Was this simply a matter of different standards of proof, or were psychological biases influencing how the evidence was interpreted? Believers in thoughtography argued that skeptics were so committed to materialist assumptions that they couldn't fairly evaluate evidence for phenomena that challenged those assumptions. Skeptics countered that believers were so eager to find evidence for the paranormal that they were willing to accept explanations that more cautious researchers would reject. Both sides probably had valid points. The evaluation of extraordinary claims inevitably involves subjective judgments about what constitutes sufficient evidence, and these judgments can be influenced by philosophical commitments and psychological biases. The Serios case became as much a study in the sociology of science as in the phenomenon itself. As the years passed, interest in Ted Serios gradually faded. The man who had once been the subject of international attention returned to relative obscurity. He continued to work as a bellhop and live quietly in Chicago, occasionally giving demonstrations for curious researchers but never again achieving the level of recognition he had enjoyed in the 1960s. Part of this decline was simply the natural cycle of public attention. Today's sensation becomes tomorrow's footnote. But it also reflected the scientific community's ultimate rejection of thoughtography as a genuine phenomenon. Without mainstream scientific acceptance, claims for psychic photography remained relegated to the margins of parapsychological research. Serios himself seemed philosophical about this decline. In later interviews, he expressed neither bitterness about the skepticism he had faced, nor grandiose claims about his place in history. He had done what he believed he could do, had submitted to scientific testing, and was content to let others judge the significance of the results. The physical evidence of Serios's alleged abilities, thousands of photographs, and detailed experimental records remain stored in various archives. Eisenbud's papers are housed at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, providing a detailed record of one of the most extensive investigations of claimed psychic phenomena ever conducted. These archives remain available to researchers, though few have shown interest in recent decades. But what are we to make of this strange chapter in the history of consciousness research? Was Ted Serios a genuine psychic who could somehow imprint his thoughts onto photographic film? Or was he simply a clever fraud who managed to fool even experienced investigators for several years? The answer may depend as much on our philosophical assumptions as on the evidence itself. If we approach the case with the assumption that psychic phenomena are impossible, then we're likely to conclude that some form of fraud must have been involved, even if we can't figure out exactly how it was accomplished. If we're open to the possibility that consciousness might have capabilities beyond those recognized by conventional science, then we might find the evidence more compelling. This isn't to say that all interpretations are equally valid. Evidence and logic still matter. But it does suggest that the evaluation of extraordinary claims often involves philosophical considerations that go beyond simple empirical observation. The case also raises important questions about the nature of scientific investigation itself. How should science respond to claims that seem to violate established physical laws? Should such claims be dismissed out of hand, or do they deserve serious investigation regardless of how unlikely they seem? Most scientists would argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the burden of proof for paranormal phenomena should be very high. But critics respond that this creates an unfair double standard, that normal scientific claims are accepted based on much weaker evidence than is demanded for paranormal ones. The Serios case illustrates both sides of this debate. Eisenbud conducted hundreds of controlled experiments over several years, documenting everything meticulously and taking extensive precautions against fraud. By normal scientific standards, this might seem like compelling evidence. But because the claims were so extraordinary, many researchers felt that even this level of evidence wasn't sufficient. From a historical perspective, the Ted Sirios case represents a fascinating intersection of science, psychology, and philosophy. Regardless of whether thoughtography was real, the investigation revealed important insights about the nature of scientific inquiry, the psychology of belief and skepticism, and the challenges of studying phenomena that don't fit neatly into established paradigms. The case also highlights the human dimension of scientific research. Ted Sirios wasn't just a research subject. He was a complex individual with his own motivations, fears, and limitations. The success or failure of the experiments depended not just on proper methodology, but on managing the intricate dynamics between researcher and subject. Perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that the universe may still hold mysteries that our current scientific understanding can't fully explain. Whether or not Ted Sirios could actually photograph his thoughts, his case challenges us to remain open to possibilities that might seem impossible from our current perspective. The implications extend beyond parapsychology to touch on fundamental questions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of scientific knowledge itself. If the mind can directly influence physical matter in ways we don't understand, what does that tell us about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? And if such phenomena exist but remain beyond our current ability to study them reliably, what does that suggest about the limits of scientific methodology? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in the 1960s. Modern neuroscience has revealed tremendous complexity in the brain and consciousness. But the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from physical processes, remains unsolved. The mystery of how mind relates to matter continues to puzzle philosophers and scientists alike. In recent years, some researchers have suggested that quantum mechanics might provide a framework for understanding how consciousness could influence physical systems. While these ideas remain highly speculative and controversial, they demonstrate that questions about the relationship between mind and matter haven't disappeared from scientific discourse. Meanwhile, advances in digital photography and image manipulation have created new challenges for investigating claimed psychic photography. Today's sophisticated editing software makes it easier than ever to create convincing fake photographs, but it also provides new tools for detecting manipulation. If someone claimed photographic abilities today, investigators would have both new challenges and new resources for evaluating such claims. The legacy of Ted Sirios also lives on in the ongoing debate about how science should approach anomalous phenomena. Should researchers focus only on phenomena that fit within established paradigms, or should they actively seek out and investigate claims that challenge current understanding? How much evidence is enough to justify revising fundamental scientific assumptions? These methodological questions have implications far beyond parapsychology. Science progresses by occasionally overturning established beliefs, but it also needs to maintain standards rigorous enough to filter out false claims. The challenge is finding the right balance between openness to new possibilities and appropriate skepticism about extraordinary claims. The human story behind the science is equally compelling. Ted Sirios lived a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in his humble circumstances and everyday struggles. Extraordinary in his bizarre claim to be able to photograph the invisible contents of his own mind. He submitted to years of testing, endured both acclaim and ridicule, and eventually faded back into the anonymity from which he had briefly emerged. His collaborator, Dr. Jewel Eisenbud, also paid a professional price for his investigation of thoughtography. While he continued his psychiatric practice and maintained his academic position, his reputation in some scientific circles was permanently affected by his association with paranormal research. Yet he remained convinced until his death that he had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. Their partnership represents one of the most intensive investigations of claimed psychic phenomena in scientific history. Whether or not they discovered something real, their work stands as a testament to the human drive to explore the unknown, even at considerable personal and professional cost. And what of the photographs themselves, those thousands of mysterious images that Serios claimed to produce with his mind alone? They remain as enigmatic today as they were when first developed. To believers, they represent evidence of capabilities that mainstream science has yet to acknowledge. To skeptics, they're examples of how even careful investigators can be deceived by sufficiently clever trickery. But perhaps their greatest value lies not in what they prove or disprove, but in what they represent: humanity's enduring fascination with the possibility that consciousness might be far more powerful and mysterious than we currently understand. They remind us that the boundaries between the possible and impossible may not be as fixed as we assume. The case raises one final, perhaps unanswerable question. If thoughtography were real, what would it mean for our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe? Would it suggest that consciousness is a fundamental force in the cosmos, capable of directly influencing physical reality? Or would it simply reveal another layer of complexity in the relationship between mind and matter? These questions may seem purely academic, but they touch on issues that affect how we think about free will, creativity, and human potential. If the mind can directly influence photographic film, what other capabilities might consciousness possess that we haven't yet discovered? The implications ripple outward from parapsychology into philosophy, neuroscience, and our basic understanding of what it means to be human. The story of Ted Serios ultimately becomes a mirror, reflecting our own assumptions about reality and the limits of human knowledge. Whether we see him as a fraud, a genuine psychic, or something more complex, depends on the lens through which we view the world. And perhaps that's the most important lesson his case has to teach us. The archives remain, the questions persist, and the mystery endures. In those sealed boxes in university storage rooms, thousands of photographs wait, images that may represent either the greatest discovery in the history of consciousness research or one of its most elaborate deceptions. They continue to challenge us to think carefully about the nature of evidence, the limits of scientific knowledge, and the extraordinary possibilities that might lie hidden within the ordinary workings of the human mind. And so we return to where we began, that dimly lit hotel room in Chicago, a bellhop with an impossible claim, and photographs that shouldn't exist. Whether Ted Serios could truly capture invisibility on film may remain forever unknowable. But his attempt to do so reveals something profound about the human condition, our relentless drive to push beyond the boundaries of the known, to explore the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of understanding. In the end, perhaps that's the most extraordinary thing about Ted Serios. Not what he claimed to achieve, but what he dared to attempt. In a universe that may be stranger than we can possibly imagine, his story reminds us to remain open to possibilities that might seem impossible from our current vantage point. And in that openness lies the essence of both scientific inquiry and human wonder, the recognition that there may always be another layer of mystery waiting to be discovered, another boundary between the visible and invisible waiting to be crossed. The negatives may remain hidden in museum archives, the debates may continue in academic journals, but the questions Ted Serios raised about the nature of consciousness and reality continue to ripple through our understanding of what it means to be human in an endlessly mysterious universe. And perhaps that's the most lasting photograph his story has produced. Not an image captured on film, but an impression burned into our collective imagination. A reminder that the line between the possible and impossible may be far thinner than we dare to believe. If you're in the mood for another gentle mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about human capability and the boundaries of science, our next deep dive awaits you.